A chilling discovery. 3 sets of remains are found alongside a residential street in Memphis, believed to be of young children.
We are thinking of these 3 unidentified children who should still be here with us today, and we are hoping for answers.
Law enforcement now tasked with figuring out how this happened and who these children are.
Somebody knows where these children have come from. Someone knows of missing children that we have discovered in this area.
The key pieces of evidence that have yet to be found as this chilling hunt for answers continues. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. This is definitely a nightmare. Imagine a street that you travel down every single day without a second thought, maybe out walking your dog, and now it's become a crime scene after a horrifying discovery. 3 sets of skeletal remains found within the same area, and worst of all, investigators believe those remains are from children. Now, there is a million questions that come to mind when you hear about something like this, like how long were those remains sitting there without anyone noticing, and who do these remains belong to, and how were these 3 lives lost? Now, we're going to go through the details of what we know so far from law enforcement, Memphis police speaking publicly about this. And also, I'm going to talk to forensic death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan, and he's going to join me in a moment. We'll be talking a little bit about how we can find out who these remains belong to and what the story behind them may be. But before we get to all of that, I want to walk you through how this tragic discovery was made and how the story began just outside Memphis, Tennessee.
This investigation began on March 8, 2026, when officers responded to a suspicious person call in the 3400 block of Ridge Meadow Parkway. They were having a walk with their dog, and they stumbled upon what they thought could have been human remains or remains of an animal, and just called the police. Responding officers located what appeared to be a human skull at the edge of the woods.
So for context, Ridge Meadow Parkway is an area of Hickory Hill, right in the Memphis area. It's described as a road less than a half-mile long. It's mixed with patches of small wooded areas and small businesses. This is a road that you could drive or walk down every single day and not think twice about it. So to imagine making a discovery like this, a human skull, while someone was walking their dog, I mean, it just sounds like something straight out of a horror film. And I know how cliche that can be. But here's an even more interesting detail. This location, which local station Action News 5 in Memphis says is behind an auto parts store, is less than 4 miles from Tennessee's border with northern Mississippi. So you do have to wonder, how did these remains get there? How long were they there for? Or were these remains that were potentially planted by someone else who was just passing by? Now, another question, if this investigation began a month and a half ago, why are we just learning about it now? Why is it now police are going public? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but I do want to continue with the information law enforcement is now putting out to the public.
Due to the limited lighting conditions at that time, a more extensive search was scheduled for the following day. On March 9th, officers and personnel from the medical examiner's office returned to continue the search.
Law enforcement did not say if any remains were discovered on March 9th, but it appears more personnel, including from the medical examiner's office, were called to participate in the search. But then you have the next day, March 10th, a chilling lead.
On March 10th, investigators along with the medical examiner's office and Shelby County Search and Rescue conducted a more thorough canvass of the area. During that search, cadaver canine units alerted to a nearby drainage pipe, indicating the possible presence of additional human remains.
Investigators already have a human skull. Just 2 days into their search, cadaver dogs were alerted to a nearby drainage pipe, another possible location for human remains. So this search is now taking officials underground.
On March 16th, investigators worked with the City of Memphis Drain Maintenance Division to inspect that drainage system. A camera system was used to examine the interior of the pipes based on those prior canine alerts. On April 1st, investigators assessed the drainage system from a nearby location and located what appeared to be an additional skull.
So I want you to think about the timeline that we have here. March 10th, you have cadaver dogs, and they tip off this drainage pipe for human remains, and it takes investigators 3 weeks to discover what appears to be another human skull And you have to imagine just how difficult it is to be searching through a city's drainage system. But now, with the new discovery of a second human skull, the search is moving forward. And then the next day, authorities make their largest finding yet.
On April 2nd, search teams conducted another coordinated canvass of the area, which resulted in the recovery of 14 additional bones consistent with human remains.
14 additional bones discovered in the surrounding area. Now, in our conversation with Joseph Scott Morgan, I asked him whether he thinks these bones could be like maybe 5 years old, or are we talking about remains that could be 50 years old? We really don't know at this point, but some very interesting information about the science that will go into that we'll talk about here in just a moment, in a story that is frankly terrifying when you think about potentially how these remains may have gotten to these locations in Memphis. And then what police share next in their news conference, it makes this story even more heartbreaking.
At this time, based on the remains recovered and the initial analysis by the medical examiner's office, we could confirm that the remains are believed to be those of 3 individuals estimated to be between the ages of 3 and 7.
According to the preliminary analysis, these remains are believed to be of 3 children between the ages of 3 and 7. Anyone's remains being discovered in this type of fashion, obviously, it is devastating. But for these remains to potentially belong to children that young is beyond comprehension. Now, I want you to keep in mind that about 170 people are involved in this case. You have the Memphis Police Department, you have the Memphis Fire Department, officials from Shelby County, the FBI is playing a part in this, as well as the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, TBI, and then you have the forensic experts. And they have been hard at work for weeks at this point, trying to figure out what led up to this mystery. What is the answer to who these children are? But there is still more to discover, including how long these remains were there, which officials gave an estimate on in the press conference, and their answer may shock you.
Just based on the information that we're getting from the medical examiner's office and the anthropologists and the scientists that are working with us, we're thinking a few years.
Now, based on what information officials are receiving, they believe these remains have been there for years. So it does beg the question, what made them visible now? Also still at large, who do these remains belong to? I keep saying it because it is such an important question in this story.
We conducted a review of all of our recent missing persons reports. And anytime we have young people, especially of this age, that are missing, we do an Amber Alert. So we knew that this individual was not, or these individuals were not persons that were reported out of our area. At this particular time, we're going to follow every inch of this investigation, no stone unturned, to just look at the possibilities. These individuals could be from somewhere not from this city, but we are looking at all of the elements of the investigation. Identification is ongoing, and we are working to determine these individuals' identities as well as the circumstances surrounding their deaths. Somebody knows where these children have come from. Someone knows of missing children that we have discovered in this area.
Now, while there is no current information on the exact identities of these children, the fact that they weren't reported missing in the area is certainly an interesting observation. So we are going to have to wait and see what happens as the identification process unfolds. But then you have another question that might be on your mind. Are there more remains that are still out there? Are there only 3 remains? Officials also updated the public on their latest search efforts this week as of Wednesday.
Our goal today is to conduct a thorough and methodical search of the area for additional evidence that will assist in identifying the deceased. This coordinated search is focused on a defined area along Ridge Meadow Parkway between Ridgeway Road and Winchester Road, where investigators are conducting a systematic grid search. The size of this response reflects the scope of the search area and our commitment to being thorough and not the presence of any immediate danger. We plan to be here until we feel like we have covered every square inch of this area that could potentially be part of this crime scene. We want to reassure the public that there is no indication of any active threat at this time, and we are taking a careful and methodical approach to ensure this investigation is handled thoroughly and respectfully. Anyone with information is encouraged to contact Crime Stoppers at 901-528-2274.
Now, before the update from law enforcement in Memphis, the police chief shared some words of encouragement.
Even though their lives have been silent, their voices have been silenced, we plan to be the voice and the advocates for all of our children in our community, and we will continue this investigation as long as we continue to have leads to find out what occurred with these young people.
Join us now to talk a little bit more about this investigation and what we know, what we don't know at this point is Joseph Scott Morgan, professor of applied forensics at Jacksonville State University, as well as the host of Body Bags. Always great to have you here on Law and Crime. So it's really just, and we haven't seen pictures of these remains as of yet. They've been described as bones that have been found, and police say they could have been there for years. They do know the ages roughly of the children, these three bodies that were found, the remains of three bodies that were found. Where are you on this as far as how old these remains may be?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris. This is where I stand. It's taken them a while to kind of suss this out. And you know why I know that? Because this whole case initiated all the way back on March 5th. This has been a very involved case, okay? Taken a long time and a lot of folks working on it. And when you find remains that are surface deposition, which means on top of the ground, which it sounds like these were, at least some of them, because they haven't released a lot of information. The remains themselves, skeletal remains, will be exposed for a protracted period of time to environmental conditions. And let's think about how rough the environment is in Memphis. You're not too far away from the Mississippi River, lots of heat, humidity. You're in a wooded area. So that's going to impact the way the bones appear because they're not protected. Like these are not like casketed remains, okay, or often some ossuary. These remains have been exposed to the elements. So one of the things you look for, and I would urge anybody to kind of check this out online, bones over a period of time, skeletal remains will develop a specific patina, and you'll have, they'll go through a phase where you have fresh skeletal remains that you can actually still pick up on, like a bit of remnant of tissue or blood that's there, and that kind of stains the surface. But as the bones age, they'll bleach a little bit, okay, and they'll start to gravitate more to white. But then, over a period of time, they begin to yellow, okay, and then on top of the yellowing, they get these little markings of patina, and a lot of that has to go to the heat, the humidity, and also the deposition of where fat had existed on the tissue itself as well. There are a lot of factors, so it's kind of hard to pin it down. I wish I knew more. Fascinated by the fact that apparently with the skull, the initial skull, which was found, by the dog walker, we've heard about that.
Yeah.
It was a little while later that the other remains were found, where there was another skull found, and then this non-specific deposition. I think that it was 14 other components, skeletal components. So I'd like to know how far away from the original point of the skull that was initially found are from these other remains, and then was there any depth to the remains where they are subsurface in any way? Is this something where, Memphis, you can get periodic flooding depending upon the region that you're in? I suspect this might be a bit of a higher elevation as opposed to right adjacent to the river. Literally, the town, I think, is called Hickory Hill.
Yep. So
I don't know if there's some kind of elevated area. It might not be as prone to flooding. Hydrology comes into this when you have clandestine graves or burials, because the water, as it flows, will wash away surface dirt. If these remains were all in a shallow grave, you could wash it away enough so that these things are exposed. And if that initial skull was away from the later deposition, I'm thinking maybe an animal got to the skull. Dogs love skulls. I can't tell you how many times I've had cases where dogs will literally come walking up into the yards of their own homes, and they'll have skull. And for some reason, they're attracted to that. That happens a lot. Did animals migrate this particular element away from the primary location? I don't know. We'll find out. I know that's a lot of information, but right now you're just you're kind of walking around blind. And it's tough.
Well, because in all of that's fascinating when you just think of the science that's going to go into not only figuring out how long these remains have been there, but then you have to think about like, who are these children? And I know that there's from local reports, there's like a preschool nearby, which like, I don't know how old that preschool is, you know, and I'm sure there's detectives going through records of the, you know, the neighborhood trying to figure out if there was missing children or, you know, someone years ago that didn't show up somewhere. But from a scientific standpoint, can you actually figure out, how do you figure out who these children may be?
If you and I were having this discussion, Chris, 10 years ago, I'd say this is going to be a long uphill battle. However, in the world where we live now, it's possible. And I think a lot of people are kind of sitting around wondering. Let's go back to one of the initial statements that you made, you know, talking about the school and there's a church nearby. There are even a couple of quotes from pastors. I think the big question, who's missing 3 kids? Hands, anybody? Who's missing 3 kids? You know, how do 3 kids just kind of vanish off the face of the earth? And then they are together. Okay. It's not like kids' remains who are deposited all over Shelby County, Tennessee, around the greater metro area of Memphis. That ain't what we're talking about. We're talking about 3 remains that are right there. So back to this idea of identity. It's my belief that you could go to Othram with these cases, and I've been there. I've seen their capabilities. I've seen the technology they have. And if you have viable DNA, remember, we've got 2 skulls now. My big question, you can get into the skulls, you can open the skulls, and there are a couple of bony prominences that we go into that are kind of protected that we look for, where we can extract DNA from it. From that prominence, that bony structure. I'm wondering about teeth, because that's those teeth, which are not bone, by the way, for folks that don't know that. If you can get into a tooth, that's going to be the key. The unlocking of a single identity in this case, obviously, is going to open the door for all of these remains in totality. That's the beauty of this, because there's some people I've seen, and this is not Morgan saying this, this is other people saying this, could they all be brothers? Well, we're talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, we're talking about an age range. I think they've said, is it 3 to 7?
3 to 7. Yeah.
Yeah, 3 to 7. So, boy, this is that's a real tight zone that you're talking about, 3 to 7 years of age. And there are ways that, and trust me, they've got several forensic anthropologists that are working on this. This is more the bailiwick of the anthropologist than it is a pathologist. You know, Tennessee, the state in total, has produced some incredible minds in forensic anthropology. All you got to do is look to the east with UT, with the Body Farm. That has been the source for a lot of brilliant minds in forensic anthropology, and these people many times continue to work in Tennessee. Memphis has a long history of having some fantastic anthropologists that have come through that office. So they're going to be looking at the bones, getting age ranges, which they've already done, because developmentally with children, there are certain things that you look for on a human remain of a child that is young. There are certain things that you look for in these changes, and they can pin that age range down, but you still don't know who they are. If you can get that one strand, do familial DNA with it, you're going to knock it out of the park, I think.
I think of the age range, too, where we're not talking about a newborn who could have been kept out of sight. No. Maybe a newborn born in a home, you know, something like that no one knew ever existed. Like 3 to 7, yeah. I feel like there's at least, especially if one of those children were 7 years old, like you're thinking that there's like a social circle there. You know, I don't know if they were in school, even if they weren't. Like if you know, they would be people who I think a neighbor might be able to think about, you know, potentially in that case. With that said, like kind of going back to like figuring out how old these remains may be, like, are we talking if you have bones like 5 years or like 50 years? Like what's like the potential ballpark we're talking here of how old these remains may be?
Wow. Excellent question. And again, that is going to be completely dependent upon what they're finding at the scene. If there's a depressed area out there, and just kind of let me back up and I'll keep it brief. When we're working a scene like this with skeletal remains, we look for naturally occurring depressions in the ground. And again, topography plays into this relative to skeletal remains. Is it a naturally occurring depression where a body was found? Or can you make out an outline where a grave has previously been dug? How many cases have we covered, Chris, over the years where you've got these family annihilators out there, for instance, that will dig a grave and they'll just put everybody in there and you get commingling of remains. I don't know in this case how extensive they had to go down to get the rest of these remains. Are these all surface remains? If they're surface remains, I cannot imagine that these would be like a historic burial,
right?
Where you're going back, years and years and years. The other piece to this, how much history do they know about this area? If you want to go down this road, one of the big questions I would ask when I show up, if I've got 3 remains here and suddenly, they've all popped up, is there like an old graveyard around here?
Right.
Okay, and that's certainly something you have to keep in mind. And, Shelby County would have that on the books. Remember how I talked about there was a church? Well, there's a couple of churches. Sometimes you can have churches that go under, and you'll have graveyards that are forgotten about. Nobody removes graves. That doesn't sound like that's what this is, because these sound like surface depositions. It's certainly within their capability, they being the forensic anthropologist, to bracket a time, but it's going to be really hard for them to reduce that spectrum. I'd say a 5-year period is going to be what you're looking at. How long have they been out there? We're measuring time now, not by the age of the bodies of these children in life. Now we're talking about time as to how long they've been in this environment. You got to know what you're doing. I mean, you need the top line people to be able to, to give you some kind of assessment. And again, as investigators, death investigators, we love time benchmarks, and the public likes them too, but we particularly do, because if we have a scientific benchmark that has a time associated with it, we can begin to work the case just from a standpoint of who occupied this area, who occupied the space, who might have been familiar with this wooded area. Is it a point where people would walk through on a regular basis? We got this dog walker. How long have people been walking dogs in there?
Right.
Why is it that this particular dog found this initial element and no other dogs that have walked through this area? Why have no other humans seen it? Has something changed? And then you've always got this other specter that's in the back of your mind. Did somebody have these somewhere else and they put them out there?
Right. Like how likely is it that this is the place where the bones initially were put, as opposed to them being brought there? Another part for me, because I know Memphis police have said that homicide detectives are investigating, and look, 3 to 7-year-old kids, like, they just don't go miss. It's not like an unattended death situation that sadly we see maybe with someone who is homeless or someone who goes missing, and you have those types of cases. Like, there needs to be an explanation as to why 3 kids between the ages of 3 and 7 and their remains are here. With that said, if you have bones, like how likely is it, without maybe the investigative work on the outside of figuring out who these kids are, maybe they go missing from a school, all of this, but like, how do you figure out the cause of death?
Very difficult. Skull is going to be our primary source. You always flee to the skull in practice. Intellectually, you want to assess the skull because you're looking for any kind of lethal trauma. We do know that most perpetrators, that they're going to target the neck or the head, particularly with children. If you're thinking about an execution style killing, say, for instance, and I've had a couple of these where the perpetrator shoots the child in the back of the head, and you're going to have a bullet defect. Blunt force trauma, you can have fractures. This is where it gets a bit more difficult, because if you have blunt force trauma, if you have fractures, sometimes skeletal remains will in fact fracture as a result of age. Okay. So, and that's where the forensic anthropologist comes in. And they're so good at it. You're going to look for a fracture line. Is this associated with something in the antemortem state, like trauma, any kind of blunt force impact, as opposed to kind of a naturally occurring event? You can get it with long bones too. I've seen it happen. As bones begin to degrade, they become progressively more fragile, particularly if they're exposed to the elements. So they're taking a long, protracted time to look at this. Here's something else folks might not think about, but did you know that the totality of these bones are going to be x-rayed? Some folks would say, why do you need to x-ray bones? Well, it's important because there are little nuances on the surface of the bones and contained therein inside of the bones. You can look for certain elements that might be traumatically related that are not quite as obvious with the unaided eye. This is such a complex investigation. Again, March 5th, remember? That's
right. We go all the way
back. This whole thing kicks off.
Yeah.
I'm looking at us right now. We're time stamped right now at this moment in time as we're talking, April 24th. And so they've been at this for a bit. This just has jumped into the news. So they've been keeping it close to the vest. I submit to you that there will still be people walking about out there, maybe people with badges and maybe people without badges. They're going to be looking. And it would not surprise me if someone just happened to come across one more skeletal element out there. That happens. I mean, and it happens a lot. You get that with skeletal depositions. You get it with explosive deaths. I've had some of those where that occurred, where there's just stuff that you don't pick up on in the initial pass. And we're beyond kind of initial pass here, I know. Mm-hmm. But, they're, and if this is a commonly trafficked area, now you've got the area disturbed. If there are any animals that come through there, like another dog, they might sniff out something in there that us humans might not. I mean, you got to utilize every tool, in your toolbox. They're going to also go back, and I would imagine they will probably do a bit of GIS mapping in there with drones where they can get an idea, again, of the topography, get an idea of what kind of changes have taken place over the years that you can appreciate from a bird's eye view. Police are going to be asking themselves, is this an area we've ever had anything like this before? Because I've seen the two words floating around already, serial killer. Of course, with serial killings, you get specific dump sites. Is that what we're looking at here? I don't know. I still, we have far more questions than answers at this point, but this is very dense material. There will be more analysis. I always hold to this, Chris, as an old death investigator. If I can find out who somebody is, that's half the battle. Because if you find out who somebody is, you understand their social circle, and then it's from there that you can begin to develop a narrative here as to what may have happened.
Yeah, and it is going to be interesting to see what happens. I think to your point, I mean, this, Memphis police have been looking at this since early March, and just now going public with this information, and they're still kind of in this point of trying to figure this out and now appealing to the public to see if someone can say, hey, maybe, there was a 7-year-old that I used to see in the neighborhood, but I don't really know what happened. And then maybe that leads to some of the answers here. Very sad story, likely associated with this. We'll see what happens next. Joseph Scott Morgan, host of Body Bags. Always a pleasure to have you here on Law and Crime. Also, of course, professor of applied forensics at Jacksonville State University. Thanks for being with us.
You bet, Chris. Thank you.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're also streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.